First of all, hello. Welcome back to Yale. My name is Stephen Latham. I'm the Deputy Director of the Yale Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics. We sit over across campus kind of near the Forestry School. I teach undergraduate courses in bioethics and law, and I have colleagues who teach philosophical and moral theological bioethics courses to undergrads. I also teach some healthcare School of Management mid-career executives about ethics in healthcare systems. So that's who I am. And my talk is called This Year in Bioethics, or Why I Have a Good Job. Okay? And what I'm going to do is dash through a number of topics in bioethics, and I will really dash through them, and then open it up for you all to ask questions about whichever ones might be most interesting to you. So, first of all, that's Yale's Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics. We have our own little house, as I said, up on Prospect Street, about as far away on campus from the medical school as is possible. But that's okay because it's actually very healthy for everyone to walk back and forth. We also do some teaching over there, and we have a number of medical school faculty who are part of our center. There's a lot of back and forth there. All right, now, today I'm going to rush through the following many topics, a lifespan's worth of topics and beyond. I'm going to start pre-birth, talking about human embryonic stem cells, then birth, cesarean sections, childhood, vaccination, adulthood, post-traumatic stress disorder, and then a little bit about obesity, patient decision aids, and end-of-life physician-assisted suicide, and beyond. The beyond is synthetic biology, since that has nothing to do with our lifespan. It has instead to do with recent stories about the creation of life in the laboratory, which are actually quite interesting. So, as you see, there are many topics. I'm going to spend, I hope, maybe 2 minutes on each so that we have discussion time at the end. This is from 30,000 feet at quite a pace, so let's begin. That's a human embryonic stem cell, and that's my first topic, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. They are, human embryonic stem cells are human cells, and they are embryonic in the sense that they have been removed from an embryo in vitro in a petri dish, and they are pluripotent because the multi-celled, say 8-celled pre-embryo in the petri dish has the ability to grow up to be a baby, right? Each one of those cells in there has the ability to specialize and become any kind of cell in a human body, a nerve cell, a pancreatic cell, a blood platelet, whatever it may be. So these cells in the petri dish are very special because as yet they're undifferentiated, they're all identical. But if they're coaxed properly by being exposed to different proteins and things, they can actually specialize into various kinds of adult cells, which is why researchers think that they hold out a lot of promise. They're also immortal in the sense that if you reproduce them in the petri dish and get more and more of them, their telomeres don't shrink. The cells themselves don't go through cellular aging as they multiply and divide. So you can, from a single human embryonic stem cell, you can make a dish full of them, and then you can make 1,000 dishes full of them, and you can send them to researchers around the world, and indeed that is what's happening with human embryonic stem cells. The lines are in international traffic around the world so that researchers in different parts of the globe are working with genetically identical material in doing their research so they can duplicate or challenge one another's research in that way. So, of course, the core ethical issue is that they are human and embryonic, and therefore some people assimilate the destruction of the embryo in the petri dish to abortion or indeed to the murder of a child, because this is an entity that has all the genetic components of a human being. In research, human embryonic stem cells are useful for a couple of reasons. The first is the most important, and it doesn't get a lot of publicity, and that is testing drugs. Because, for example, we have a researcher here at Yale who uses human embryonic stem cells, coaxes them forward by exposing them to different agents, proteins. She makes them into liver cells. Thousands and thousands of identical human liver cells that did not come from a living human donor, didn't require surgery to remove from anyone. And those liver cells, then, she can expose drugs to them and see how human liver metabolizes drugs. So you can use human embryonic stem cells to speed up and enhance the safety of drug testing. And if we're going to see a therapeutic result from human embryonic stem cells in the short term, it'll be because of drug production. The thing that gets, and I put a little note there, the need for diseased tissue. What you might want to do is test drugs on tissue that has genetic disease. So you use a human embryonic stem cell that has a genetic disease because the embryo it came from had a genetic disease, and then you can test to see how drugs affect the expression of that disease at the cellular level. All right, next, custom tissue generation as a therapy for cellular disease. This is the thing that gets most publicity. You can take a human embryonic stem cell and coax it forward into becoming, say, a pancreatic cell of the sort that helps us regulate our blood sugar levels. It's possible then that we could manufacture replacement cells for people and create cures for diabetes or for Parkinson's or for a number of diseases that occur at the cellular failure kind of level. The problem is that if you make these replacement cells using a human embryonic stem cell, this kind of research has been done in mice, for example. Replacement cells have been made and put in mice. Replacement cells for spinal column injury and so on. But the problem is that the bodies reject them because they aren't our own, in the same way that you might reject a donated organ. Your body says, oh, this is a foreign thing, and sends all the white cells after it to get rid of it. Well, that may be resolvable by combining human embryonic stem cell research with cloning. The idea is I take a cell of yours, I pop the nucleus out, I put that in place of the nucleus of an egg, allow it to multiply to about the 8-cell stage, when it's very small. It's smaller, the whole thing is smaller than the period at the end of a sentence in a printed book. But you dismantle that into its component cells and make embryonic stem cell lines from those component cells. And every one of those embryonic stem cell lines now has your genetic makeup because the nucleus for that egg was taken from you. And that means if we now manufacture a cell to help cure your diabetes, your body will greet it as its own. So the possibility is out there, and it's many years hence, but the possibility is there that embryonic stem cells could be used to create replacement cells genetically tailor-made for people with cellular-based diseases. There's another possibility of resolving the rejection problem by parthenogenesis, and I'll say a word about this because it comes up in the next slide or so. Parthenogenesis means you take an egg that's not fertilized and you coax it into splitting up as if it were an embryo. And it takes some doing, and this doesn't occur naturally with any mammals, though it does occur in nature with frogs, for example. The egg, without being fertilized, can spontaneously start to split. And then you can make human embryonic stem cell lines from these splits. Now, there's no possibility with mammals or with humans that the parthenote can ever become an infant, right? They don't have enough genetic material to do that, but you can make embryonic stem cell lines out of it, and then you can use the stem cell lines to make replacement cells. And those cells, since they only have a mom and not a dad, have only half as many of what are called histocompatibility antigens. That means there are only half as many points that your body can reject as being not its own when you transplant something into your body, so that a parthenote cell stands twice as good a chance, if you like, as an ordinary cell from someone else, as to not be rejected by your body, if that makes sense, all right? So let's move on. Why is this in this year in bioethics? This is an issue that's been going on for some time. Well, because this year, President Obama announced the NIH funding scheme for doing research with stem cells. And here's what he's said. He said that he will fund research on stem cell lines only if they have been developed from leftover embryos from fertility clinics. In vitro fertilization commonly leaves extra embryos because you make more in case the couple doesn't get pregnant on the first try or the second try. You have extras. There are more than 400,000 excess embryos in the United States right now in freezers. A hefty chunk of them, the embryo creating parents, have consented for their use in research. So those will research on stem cell lines that are created from those leftover embryos will be funded by the Obama NIH. This is in contrast to President Bush, who would only fund lines that already existed when he announced his funding scheme, because he didn't want federal monies to be implicated in the destruction of future embryos. President Obama is permitting federal money to be used as long as the embryos come from these fertility clinics. Neither under Obama nor under Bush, nor going back to President Clinton in '93, can you use any federal money actually to split up the embryo and destroy it and create the stem cell lines. That's been no federal funding for the creation of the lines. You have to get foundation money or private money or state money, like from the state of Connecticut, which funds human embryonic stem cell research. You make the line with that money, and then you can go to NIH and get research money after the line has been created. The idea, again, is that federal money shouldn't be implicated in the destruction of embryos because so many people feel so strongly about that issue. President Obama won't fund any research on lines that are created in the lab, which means a diseased line that you actually create in order to test a disease. Instead, you're going to have to troll through the IVF clinic excess embryos to see if any of them have the genetic diseases that you're interested in order to do federally fundable research. And President Obama won't fund work on parthenotes or on cloning, lines that were created through parthenogenesis or through cloning. And there are two reasons. One is, and the NIH published this when they published the funding rules. One is they said there's not as much agreement about the idea that it's okay to create an embryo and then destroy it for research purposes. These leftover IVF clinic embryos, at least we know that if they aren't used in research, they will eventually be destroyed. So fewer people object to using them in research. But to make an embryo in the lab and then destroy it seems to many people to be more offensive. So that's one consideration. But that doesn't explain parthenotes, for example, which aren't really embryos. They can't ever become a human being, even if they were implanted. The reasoning there, and here again it's something NIH said in its publicity, the reasoning there seems to be that we don't want to have the federal government involved in paying women to donate eggs. Because to donate an egg is actually quite a procedure, whether for fertility or for research. But we don't want the US government going out and putting women through this very invasive hormonal treatment that makes them produce more eggs, and then surgery that takes the eggs from them. The Obama administration has just decided not to go there. I note at the very same time as the state of New York has just decided actually that they approve of the idea of paying women for their eggs. So the situation in this country, the sort of overall situation, is that we have incredibly liberal research laws. Nothing isn't permitted. Whereas there are some countries like Austria or Ireland where it's actually illegal to conduct certain kinds of embryonic research. But in the US, you can do everything. The only question is, where do you go to get funding for it? Is it the federal government? Is it the state government? Is it private foundation? And that also reflects how much funding is available for it. Finally, the Obama administration has restrictions on funding research that involves mixing the genetic material of humans and animals. They particularly don't want to fund mixes of human and animal genetic material that will find their way into the germline, in other words, be passed on to the children of the research embryo that you're creating. As far as I know, there aren't many people who are actually interested in doing that kind of research. So that restriction is not very painful to research scientists. There are scientists who do want to mix human and animal material, but they want to mix them at the cellular level to see what happens. For example, you can do a lot of basic stem cell research using a cow egg or a frog egg and putting human genetic material into that and then producing stem cells in the petri dish. But they all get destroyed after a few days. It's just less expensive and less difficult to obtain a cow egg than to get a woman to donate egg for research. So there are animal-human mixtures being used in the labs, but nobody has the island of Dr. Moreau in mind. Nobody's trying to make the pinky in the brain mouse with the human personality or all that. So, all right, now I spent probably the most time on this topic, and I'll move through my next topics more quickly. Cesarean sections. This is the expression too posh to push has found its way into the British press, and here's why. It was just announced that the US C-section rate is the highest of, this is data from 2007, but they've just been crunched and released. 31.8% of American births are by C-section. That's crazy high. Brazil is ahead of us with a higher rate, but the WHO has looked at this and sort of made an estimate that the healthiest rate in terms of avoiding problems with natural childbirth and not doing excessive surgery is around 15%. So we're really, really high. And the question is why? And one answer that you find in the literature and, of course, in the popular press is this too posh to push answer, which is that women, and particularly comparatively wealthy career women, are demanding C-sections because they can be scheduled. You can say, all right, I'm having this baby on a Tuesday, right? And there's also some question that some women might fear side effects of natural birth. There's a little bit more problem in the short run with incontinence, I believe, with natural birth. And there is also just what might be just the fear of the labor process itself, which, as I'm sure some of you know, is not comfortable, right? So this is where the line too posh to push comes from. And I will say that in the medical literature, every C-section that doesn't have a medical indication, in the recent years, the medical literature has referred to these routinely as cesarean section on maternal demand or cesarean section on maternal request, as if every non-medically indicated C-section was because mom asked for it, okay? However, and I've published an article about this not long ago, however, there's a lot of data around that shows that C-sections happen more on Fridays, that there's difference between daytime and evening rates of C-sections, even within the same medical practice, that C-sections go up when reimbursement for procedures is higher than reimbursement for natural childbirth to the physicians, that physicians sometimes perform C-sections because they're afraid of malpractice. It's easier to say, I did everything if you've performed a procedure than if you've just been standing there watching what happens, right? Or at least that's the logic. And there are certain practices that seem to just habitually recommend C-sections more often than others. It might be the personalities of physicians in different areas that are driving this. Now, what's the proportion of these that result from maternal request, and what's the proportion that result from physicians projecting their preferences onto women? And does anyone, including the physician or the woman, know which is which all the time? We don't know. But the main theme of my article was we should stop referring in the literature to these as all resulting from maternal demand, because at least some of them don't. Some research has been done in Brazil that shows that women going into pregnancy in Brazil all say they want natural childbirth, and after conversations with their physicians, Brazil has the highest C-section rate in the world, 36 or something like that. All right, next topic, vaccination. This man is Andrew Wakefield. A few years ago, Andrew Wakefield published an article in the Lancet journal that claimed to find a link between the onset of autism and the triple measles, mumps, rubella vaccination that was then being given. He had very poor scientific design. There were only a dozen kids involved in this trial. Numerous researchers around the world have attempted to duplicate this research and have not been able to, and indeed, this research and some of the actual charts from the article now show up in the medical literature as examples of misleading ways to present research findings. Recently, this year, in 3 months ago or so, Andrew Wakefield lost his medical license in the UK because he was convicted by the licensing board of having committed various kinds of fraud in connection with the publication of this article, and also failing to disclose before he even did the article that he was in pay for some plaintiff's attorneys, by some plaintiff's attorneys who represented parents with autism who were trying to blame drug companies for their children's autism. And he did not declare this anywhere in the course of producing or publishing the article. So he has lost his medical license, and the article itself was depublished by Lancet. They've gone back and said, that's not ours anymore. They've taken it out of the electronic database and put up a little notice saying, no, 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 this doesn't exist. 10 of the 12 co-authors on this piece have also now disavowed its findings and written separate letters saying that it was a mistake to publish it and to spin the results the way they did. Nonetheless, a lot of damage was done. Vaccination rates in the UK, which had been up in the 95% range, which is well enough to give everyone herd immunity from these childhood diseases, plummeted down to something in the 60s, and in parts of London even hit below 50% vaccination rate because parents were afraid of giving their children autism. And we had deaths from measles in the UK for the first time in something like 13 years. Not only from measles, but from encephalitis related to measles and a couple other things. So we had serious incidence of measles and mumps rose dramatically. After this conviction this year, it seems as if the anti-vaccination fervor has reduced a little bit, and the vaccination rates in the UK are starting to rise a little bit. There was an effect here in the United States of this publicity as well. You might have seen Jenny McCarthy, the former Playboy model who until recently was married to Jim Carrey, the comic actor. She was going around talking about vaccination autism connections. And that has had an impact on vaccination in the United States. So one question we might ask is, what should we do about this kind of thing in connection with our vaccine policy? There's a trade-off between the public health benefits of vaccination and liberty, right? Some people have religious reasons to not want vaccination. Other people just have reasons about fear. They don't want vaccination. How far should we respect that? The answer so far is that in the US, there's wide variability on that question. Colorado, I believe it is, has a very liberal release from vaccine. You send in a note from the parents and your child doesn't have to have the school vaccine. New York, I think you need to see either one physician twice or two different physicians to get an excuse to get out of the vaccine program. So we have wide variability, and in the states where it's easy to get out of public vaccination, vaccination rates have reduced recently because, in part, of this autism scare. We have, last year, we had a little kerfuffle in Virginia and in Texas over the vaccine for human papillomavirus. HPV causes cervical cancer. We now know that cervical cancer, many varieties of cervical cancer, are sexually transmitted. And if you vaccinate boys and girls, not just girls, because it's sexually transmitted, you vaccinate the boys and the girls for HPV, and you can dramatically reduce the instance not only of cervical cancer, but also of genital warts and some other unpleasant sexually transmitted diseases. But a couple of states tried to add the HPV vaccination to the mandatory school vaccine program, and the parents went ballistic because, of course, it's a vaccine against sexually transmitted diseases, and the clear implication is that your child is going to be sexually active at a relatively young age. Now, the public health statistics confirm that your child is going to be sexually active. Or at least statistically, it's quite likely. But many parents are offended by that, and many parents then may turn and withdraw their children entirely from the vaccine program, not just from this one, but from the whole thing, and then we have mumps, okay? So there's an interesting kind of ethical question about where we should go with the balance between individual liberty and public health, and how we should tailor the vaccine program to make it as effective as possible and as inoffensive to people who really are worried about these things, really trying to protect their kids. So, next issue, post-traumatic stress disorder. We had a report earlier this year that incidence of PTSD is skyrocketing. The military is very worried about this with our troops coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan. Apparently the levels of PTSD coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan are much higher even than the levels that we saw after the Vietnam War. Not only that, but we know the prevalence is up because of our returning troops. The diagnosis is also up too, and we know that the rates are actually higher among rape and abuse victims, for example, than they are among people returning from the battlefield. There also seems to be an enhanced susceptibility of women to PTSD for some reason that people don't really have a good handle on. But women and men in the same stressful situation, the woman is more apt to get the symptoms that characterize PTSD. The definition of PTSD is a little bit in flux. This year also, the American Psychiatric Association is coming out with their update for their diagnosis manual, and they're adjusting the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder to include things like a kind of second-hand trauma. In other words, you don't have to be the person who is on the firing line. It might be enough if you were exposed to repeated images of the traumatic event for you to suffer PTSD. And of course, the debate there is, well, some people say this is clinically justified because they see patients who have the symptoms, the depression and the anger and the uncontrollability and the reliving and the night sweats and all the things that go with PTSD. They see these patients who, for example, have seen many, many times the videos of people leaping out the windows on 9/11, all right? And that, they weren't there, they weren't at the scene, they didn't witness it, but having seen it at a distance a number of times, they're experiencing the post-traumatic stress symptom. Well, some people think that that definition needs to be wider so more people can be brought into the health system and have their symptoms treated, and other people worry about criterion creep and about how this is going to show up in the courtroom as causes of action for damages and so on. Some of the interesting ethical issues here are that one way you can prevent PTSD is by giving people beta blockers either before an anticipated traumatic experience, like just before you go out into the battlefield, or just after. And beta blockers aren't any kind of exotic, crazy medicine. They're pretty normal and we understand their effects. But what they do is they allow you to retain the memory of the event separated from a lot of its emotional and psychological impact. It's a little bit, there's a sort of film of objective distance between you and your own memory. Is that good medicine or is it creepy? Right? Are we saving people from developing symptoms? Yes, we are, of a very debilitating psychiatric condition. But we are also, in some ways, people worry about diminishing the emotional impact on the battlefield might reduce soldiers' guilt. It might enhance commanders' willingness to send their troops into more stressful situations. It might reduce the self-control of military and others, first responders and so on, in stressful situations. It might also be undermining something that we think of as important for personality, right? The emotional content of an event is part of what it is to have an important event in your memory, and dealing with that makes it part of your personality. But we don't want people walking around with the debilitating symptoms of PTSD. So there's an interesting ethical dilemma. There's also problems about the use of animal studies in PTSD because we do animal studies where we stress out the animals and expose them to trauma and try to see what happens to their different levels of hormones and how their brains respond. We do brain scans on them and so on. And of course, animal rights activists look at this and say, well, you know, animal brains aren't that great a model for human brains. Is it really worth this kind of cruelty to get results that don't really map that well onto human brains? That's another issue. And finally, there's the question of if you screened for PTSD and diagnosed with it, but there's no treatment, haven't you just upped the risk of stigmatization without actually conferring any benefit? You've given someone a name to be called, perhaps, but not necessarily conferred a benefit. Now, people are talking about the possibility of treatment through reliving the traumatic experience. That seems to reduce some of the symptoms. So it may be that this problem is going away because we are coming up with better ways to relieve the symptoms of PTSD. Obesity, the next topic. And I'm making decent time here. This one's quick. Obviously, it's a huge problem. We don't really understand why people are becoming obese. There's a genetic component. There's huge environmental components about what kinds of food are available to people, what kinds of time they have to eat that food. The patterns in which we eat our food are not very good for us, as it turns out. The kinds of exercise facilities or environments they have available to them, and so on. There's also some speculation that the microbes we have in our guts have a lot to do with how we deal with food. More of the genetic material in your body belongs to the foreign microbes that live in you and on you than actually belong to you. That's a kind of sobering thought. You're not actually a person, you're just kind of a home for a really big colony. And you could not live without these little colonists. They're digesting your food for you, for example. And there are millions of them. They're on your skin, they're in your sinuses, they're throughout you. And they're doing a lot of work. We live with these creatures. Well, some of them may have something to do with the way we handle our food, and some people, I mean, there are speculations that it might even be that the relationship between some causes of obesity and antibiotics that have killed things in our guts that actually we should have kept around because they're helpful. Anyway, we don't really understand all the causes of obesity, and we do a lot of blaming the victim. You must be fat because you eat too much, because you don't exercise too much. You watch TV late at night, and everyone wants to tell you that this is actually in your control. If only you buy my product, you will be thin. But for some people, there isn't that level of control. So here are these interventions we can use to control people's cigarette smoking habits. Oops, I mean their obesity. All right, I'm making a little public health point with my slides here. The interventions are exactly the same. The menu of interventions are exactly the same. We can try to push for individual habit changes by publicity and education. We can try to do individual medical interventions like bariatric, these things. We can provide labels and information. The Obama health plan includes calorie labeling for all fast food chains. If you own more than 6 fast food stores, you have to provide calorie labeling. You'll see it shortly in a Starbucks and a McDonald's and a Dunkin' Donuts near you. And the fast food industry wanted it because they saw it coming at the state level, and they thought, we'd rather have one federal standard for reporting calories than 50 state standards, right? So that's coming as part of health reform. We can tax foods that are bad for us the same way we tax cigarettes and alcohol. We can regulate the actual content of foods, the way New York, for example, was the first mover in banning trans fats from foods. We can establish tort liabilities for people who produce foods that are bad for us in the way that people tried to establish there has been tort liability for cigarettes, and people have tried it with things like handguns, less successfully. It was quite successful with cigarettes. We can try to do all these things and create a massive social repositioning around the issue of obesity, which is what we've done with cigarettes. It's now kind of illegal to have a cigarette in your hand in most places in the United States. And it could be, the future might hold mandatory salads or something. But we could try to move public culture in that way. And finally, we could try to get food companies actually to see that the market is moving and they want to reform and change their products to meet a market that is starting to care more than before about problems related to obesity and food-related health. We see some of this happening already with the publicity and the popularity of Michael Pollan's books and the Food Inc. movie and so on. It's out there. Supersize Me or Supersize This, whatever. Yeah, there's already some move toward massive social change on this issue. I'll do this very quickly. Another thing in the Healthcare Act that you might have heard of, the Healthcare Reform Act, is a training program to get physicians to learn how to use patient decision aids. This is where a patient has to make a decision between, say, having a surgical intervention or handling the same problem with drugs. or, there are lots of, should you have surgery for prostate cancer, given the very slow rate at which it accelerates and the possibility of harms from the surgery itself. Some people want to just do watchful waiting, and some people want the aggressive intervention. These patient decision aids inform you about what the options are and what the risks are, or that's the idea. And they're probably in the Obama healthcare plan. This pilot project to educate physicians in their use is probably in there because the rap on patient decision aids is that if you tell patients what the options are, they tend to choose the less aggressive interventions. And that means it's a cost-saving thing. Now, this was one of the many features of the Obama healthcare plan that got denounced as death panels, because the idea was that if you give patients decision aids about end-of-life care, we'll get rid of them sooner, and pretty soon we'll be deciding to do away with people and so on. But if you go on the web and look at patient decision aids and the Obama health reform, it's characterized by some people as this death panel thing. Really what it is an effort to put into the patient's hands more of the facts about treatment decisions they have to make so they can make up their own minds. But it's being pushed because they tend, or studies, a few studies show, not many, but a few studies show that they save costs. But maybe they save costs because their production has largely been paid for so far by insurance companies. Maybe they're biased to save cost. Maybe the information they contain is designed to get patients to make those choices. Well, and we know that from some of the studies that show that they save costs don't take into account the actual cost of producing the decision aid. So at the end of the day, it may be that they don't save complete cost to the healthcare system, but they are encouraging patients to take the less invasive intervention. So can we make better ones that don't have this bias? Can we measure bias? Is it real? There are rumors abounding, and that's a series of interesting questions. Physician-assisted suicide. Why is that happening this year? For a couple of reasons. Number one, the UK has just changed its assisted suicide policy. The prosecutorial authorities in the UK have decided that if you help a terminally ill loved one to commit suicide, perhaps by taking them over to Switzerland where it's mostly legal, or perhaps by helping them get a lethal dosage of pills, if you help them and they're terminally ill and they're competent and they've asked for your assistance, the prosecutorial authorities in the UK will not prosecute you for assisted suicide, the criminal offense. This is brand new this year. In the United States, last year, Washington State put an assisted suicide program in place that's modeled on its neighbor Oregon's 10-year-old assisted suicide program. And last time I looked, there had been 36 Washingtonians who had taken lethal pills to end their lives under the Washington plan. Oregon is steady at around 50 or 55 people per year over the last decade, committing suicide at the end of a difficult round of disease, cancer, ALS, and some others. Here in Connecticut, we have a lawsuit challenging the assisted suicide criminal statute here, asking that the court decide that the Connecticut legislature never intended that statute to apply to the actions of doctors in end-of-life care with terminally ill patients. We'll see whether that goes anywhere. It got a little bit of emotional boost in Connecticut recently, that lawsuit did, because a couple in North Haven, she with Alzheimer's and he with cancer, I believe, he shot her and then shot himself. And this became, unfortunately in a way, it became part of this assisted suicide debate. The question was, is this kind of tragedy a reason why we need physician-assisted suicide, or an example of the things that can go wrong if you allow people to kill themselves instead of get good, compassionate care when they're in extreme illness? Anyway, it's been quite a debate around here this year. I'm not going to... This is the Oregon Death with Dignity Act. These are all the steps you have to go through before you're allowed to get the lethal pills. Just to save time, I'm just going to tell you, there are a lot of steps. You see a couple of doctors, you're not depressed, you have to request independently, you have to be competent, your requests have to be 2 weeks apart, and you have to be able to take the pills yourself. It's not euthanasia where someone else injects you. At the end, you have the pills, you take them. That's how it works. So there are a lot of protections in place in Oregon and now in Washington, and a lot of ethical issues. Is there something intrinsically wrong with suicide, even as a way out of terrible end-of-life illness and symptoms? Is it a bad role for physicians to play, to be involved in helping people die? Shouldn't we keep their hands clean of that? Will physician-assisted suicide be used in lieu of good end-of-life care for minorities or for less educated populations who don't communicate as well or as readily with their physicians? Or for patients who don't have family support around to argue for them? Will we give patients death instead of good care because it's easier? And you can predict that it would be that the exploitation would land on more vulnerable patients, lower socioeconomic class, perhaps with mental illness, and so on. That's been one of the big worries. In Oregon, that worry has not come true. In Oregon, it's mostly pretty well-educated people. No African Americans in Oregon have used the program. If you know the geography of Oregon, it's all the people who live in the liberal, sophisticated coastal cities. Inland Oregon does not commit suicide. And it's mostly the people who do it also are people who have some levels of family support. They're people who have been married rather than loners, and they are mostly majority white patients, not minorities. And so we haven't seen big examples of exploitation in Oregon under the plan, although some people have claimed that in one case there was someone who was depressed and should have had psychiatric care instead of assisted suicide. But remember, to qualify in Oregon, you also have to have 2 doctors who have already diagnosed you terminal, which means the expectation is you'll be dead in 6 months in any case. So, now, my last topic, synthetic biology. This is a really recent hot topic. Some of you may have seen this. It was a cover story of Time, I think, and The Economist last week. A scientist called Craig Venter made the first living cellular organism with entirely lab-manufactured DNA. He took bits of DNA from the lab, spliced them together by looking at a live model of a bacterium. He sort of spliced together the DNA to match the DNA he saw in the live cell, put that DNA into the husk of an inoculated microorganism, and it took off. It started reproducing, is alive, reproduces, digests food, has a little monocellular life of its own, entirely synthetically manufactured DNA. In a way, given the state of the science of synthetic biology, this was not that big a deal. People are doing things like this all the time and have been for years. But it was a brilliant stroke of publicity, and it really did get the attention of the world because it is the first time you can say there's a life form whose DNA was laboratory manufactured from spare parts. What else has been going on in synthetic biology? Well, there's been a lot of advanced genetic engineering where we take out little bits of cells and put in other things to try to make the cells metabolize differently, to try to make them like to eat things that we would like to have eaten, like oil. And there's been a project called BioBricks that involves breaking down DNA of cells of microbes and things into little strips which seem to have isolable functions. And the idea is these BioBricks, you'll be able to take some of this and some of that and put them together and make the microbe of your choice from a menu. There's a BioBricks website that has kind of open source, here are the things we've been able to identify, and they're up listed, and you can get these spare parts and try. It's like Lego. You can make your own cell with it. Then there's minimal genome creation, where they actually take a living creature and they try to remove the bits of the DNA that don't seem to be doing anything, that aren't expressing. In humans, that's most of the DNA we have, doesn't seem to do anything that we know about. But you can go in and remove it. And the idea is to make as small a chassis as possible onto which you'll then be able to stick your BioBricks features. Okay? So this is about the business of manufacturing novel life forms that have never been seen in the lab for various kinds of applications, including medical applications, new drugs, living medicines that can go in and, I don't know, devour the deposits of plaque on the walls of your veins, or, you know, we can think of different features for creating creatures that have been genetically tailored. In industry, one of the biggest things they're talking about is using these microbes to create biofuels, particularly in the developing world. In agriculture, you can use them for pesticides or to create new food additives using this synthetic biology. Environment, I mentioned already the idea of having creatures that go devour oil. You let them loose on the oil spill and they metabolize the oil and then and clean up for us. Or you could imagine, and some people are talking about creating new creatures that have very high CO2 absorption rates to pull greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And you can also just use them to explore interesting pure biological questions about how cells work and how DNA works. Lots of ethics issues. Up at the top are security and safety. These things could be used to make bioterror weapons, novel cellular forms that do bad things to us. It's not expensive to make this stuff happen. You don't need a lot of fancy lab equipment to do it. Safety, people are worried about things escaping from the lab and then evolving in the wild and becoming, you know, hazardous creatures. Some people worry about social dislocation from new industries, particularly biofuel manufacture in the developing world. Will this be the new bananas, where we're sort of forcing a monoculture or a new industry on partners in the developing world, and will there be social dislocation from that or economic dislocation? And then there's this very abstract but in some way interesting idea that this shouldn't be done because it involves playing God. And this is an ill-defined worry. People think about what that means very differently, but there's some sense that some people have that making novel life forms, even for good purposes, is somehow beyond the scope of what it is that we human beings ought to be involved in at all, that it's hubristic. And this is a separate worry from the possibility of bad consequences, like it'll get out of our control. Now, it's a separate worry about whether we, people, are transgressing some kind of boundary about how much control we should be trying to exert over the world. All right, so Yale Bioethics, by complete coincidence, has projects going on involving every topic I've talked to you about today. A couple of our members are on the State Stem Cell Committee and on the Yale ESCRO, which is the board that oversees stem cell research here at Yale Medical School. I've mentioned my publication on C-sections. We have a risk assessment working group that's been working on the HPV vaccine risk question. We have a post-traumatic stress disorder working group that's about to publish a collection of essays on social and economic and legal aspects of PTSD. We have a project on the ethics of nutritional research on human subjects. We're trying to develop some new patient decision aids if we get the grant. And a couple of us are involved in a state brief on aid in dying for this case that I mentioned that's been brought in Connecticut. And finally, we have a partnership with the Hastings Center. The Hastings Center is the main lead think tank in bioethics in the world. And we now have a Yale-Hastings joint program in ethics and health policy. And the Hastings Center is way ahead of the game on synthetic biology and very involved in that kind of stuff. And there's so much more. Find out more about us, please, by coming to our website, which is yale.edu/bioethics. Now, I actually managed to leave a little time for some questions. So, you know, not much time, but 10 minutes or something. Oh, that's not what I want. That's what I want. So, questions, comments? Yes. Yes, you. Yes, ma'am. Yes, we have had, yes, I'll repeat the question. The question, the first part of the question was, am I worried that our technology is ahead of our ethics? And a couple of examples were things like in connection with assisted reproduction. We have a lot of male sperm donors. They don't know how many children they're having. There was a newspaper story last year about two people who couldn't get married because it emerged after they had been courting one another that they were in fact products of the same father sperm donor. And they had met socially. And one result now is that the clinics are shipping the donated sperm across the country to avoid children being born of parents, of donor parents concentrated in one area just for this kind of reason. And what was the other example? Yeah. Right, so there's questions about if you donate an egg or if you donate an embryo to research, and 15 years from now, it emerges that that embryo was used to do something that you now disapprove of, or you donate an egg and then a child is born, and what do you tell the child about the donor? That latter question, I think, as a lawyer who kind of follows some of this stuff, I think we're moving in the direction of just complete openness about all these very new and strange parental relationships. We had a wonderful case in California a few years ago where a couple who was infertile wanted a child, and they were both, I guess, infertile, because they got an egg donor mom who was married and a sperm donor father who was married. And the embryo was implanted in a surrogate mother who was married. So the couple had no biological relationship at all, including carrying the child, to the child that's being born. Well, of course, while the surrogate is pregnant, the couple split up and they say, we want no part of this anymore. So the California court gets this case, and the California court, with 8 parents to choose from, says that this child has no parents and is a ward of the state. On appeal, the appellate court said, no, the contracting couple who set this in motion has financial responsibility for this child and is the parent. It's not donor dad or egg donor mom or their spouses. It's not surrogate mom or her husband. It's the contracting couple who have the problem. And then the surrogate mom adopted the child. So the case was resolved in a kind of nice way. The mother who had carried the child to term adopted the child. But what do you say to that child about who are mommy and daddy? I think that the direction we're moving in is that what you say to them is, your sperm donor was so-and-so, and he lives in Sacramento, and your egg donor was so-and-so, she's from Merced. I was your surrogate mom, and now I'm your real mom, right? Because that's... right? I think that's the direction we're going in. The UK has recently abolished anonymous sperm donation. We haven't done that yet here, but I think we will be. I think we're moving in the direction of complete openness, and people will start to, and in fact, a lot of the clinics, fertility clinics, are already doing this. They won't help couples who don't plan to include the donor parents, at least by release of their medical information and biography to the child. The clinics are coming up with this policy on their own. It's not a requirement of law, but that's the direction. Another question. Yes, sir.
You talked about beta blocks. Is there any practical application of that, or is that just a laboratory stuff? For example, is the U.S. military offering a possibility to troops to take beta blocks?
They are not doing it prophylactically before the troops go out, which is a possibility that they're thinking about. They're funding a great deal of research into this, and I believe that that beta blockers are used immediately post-trauma to try to reduce the effects of trauma in the field. Whether that's being done under the aegis of ongoing research, I'm not sure, but it is being done with real people who faced real trauma, because that's where you can figure out whether it's efficacious. I'm not part of the Bioethics Center's PTSD project, but I believe that it has now been persuasively shown that the beta blockers really do reduce symptoms, and that's been done with people who've really faced trauma. And I know that the US military is pouring a lot of research money at this, but I'm not sure whether they have an active program of giving beta blockers to troops when they return home. Yes, ma'am?
Beta blockers are used very commonly for hypertension, for post-myocardial infarction, etc.
Yeah.
Has this same effect been done? There are tons of millions of people out there who are on beta blockers, including for migraine. So
Sure.
has this been looked at? Is this effect still there?
I don't know. You'd have to go out and find all the people who are on them and ask them about their exposure to trauma, and then try to figure out if the rate among that population was different from people who are exposed to trauma who aren't on beta blockers. That seems like it might be hard to do, but there is a lot of study on human subjects being done in this area, partly because funding is flowing from the military, and partly because people are beginning to appreciate the prevalence among victims of household abuse, rape victims, first responders who find bodies and things like that. There's very high prevalence. Police officers have a big problem with it, firemen. So there is a lot of experimentation being done on human beings, and as far as I know, there's not much question about beta blockers working. The debate is about how widely they should be accepted as a kind of an automatic response to the possibility of a stressful interaction. Yes?
Is there any thought, it seems to me we're getting close to morality at this point, if you're talking about beta blockers before battle.
Yeah.
If you take away the terrible aspects of killing people, that seems a real...
Right. So this is one of the places where there's a lot of ethical debate, is that it's an important human characteristic that we face enormous stress and have guilt and anxiety about doing terrible things or seeing terrible things. And that's possibly an adaptive feature of us that gets us to do fewer terrible things and gets us to try to avoid places where terrible things occur. So part of the ethical debate is that if these are begin to be used prophylactically, it might lead us down a path where we're undermining people's self-control, where we're overutilizing our military in situations that we can predict are going to be terrible, or where we're just, for all those patients who see the stressful things and don't develop the symptoms of PTSD, in some way we might have deprived them of a personality-forming and personality-changing traumatic experience. So all these questions about how much your memory is tied to your selfhood and whether it matters that your memory is fairly clinical or whether it needs to be one of these sock-you-in-the-gut emotional memories to really be part of you, that's a lot of where the ethics debate is. Yes, sir?
Going back to your first scenario with the donor of the sperm and the donor of the egg, and then decided to split up.
Yes.
If it's in the first trimester of the pregnancy and you are in a state that is permissive of abortions, what right does who have?
The carrying mother is the one who has an abortion right in that case. No one else. Right. There's only one kind of case in American law where men have much say about whether children will be born or not. And that is the case where there's a frozen embryo and a couple have split up. And mom says, this is my last chance at having a child who's biologically related to me. I want to implant that frozen embryo. And dad says, I don't want to have any children with you. That's why we're divorced. And the result there, in all 6 states in the US have looked at this, and all 6 states have said, dad's desire not to have children trumps mom's desire to have this last shot at a biologically related child. It's often a case where mom has had a hysterectomy or has had cancer therapy that's left her infertile, but these frozen embryos are left over from an earlier attempt. And in those cases, the courts have gone with the men. Same thing happened in England. Israel went the other way and went with the woman who wanted the child, and I'm informed that that has something to do with Israeli law and the idea that Judaism passes matrilineally, and therefore there's greater priority in the decision in the mom. But most countries, it's only the woman who's carrying the child who gets to decide about whether or not the child will be born. Yes, sir, in the green.
Could you comment on the ethics of international travel and purchase of organs?
Yeah. Well, medical tourism, they're calling it. And there's a wide variety of it. There is a black market in organs. Americans go around to South and Central America, to India, and get organs that have been procured who knows how, and they get them implanted by Western-trained physicians who get paid a fee for this. And my comment on the ethics of that is that it's bad. And it's bad for several reasons, but one of the more important reasons is that the organ donor, the organ is often someone who's sold an organ. And the conditions of that sale and the conditions of the surgery that was used to remove the organ and so on are all happening in the dark and all not subject to regulation and all potentially exploitative and terrible. We have all kinds of other bits of medical tourism going on, however. You can go to Switzerland to commit suicide. It's legal there. You can, actually some insurance companies, they're not yet forcing anyone to do this, but they're offering the patients the opportunity to have surgeries be done in India with American-trained physicians because the total cost, because the capital costs of the surgical suites and so on are so much smaller that they can afford to fly you to India and keep you in a very fancy hotel and have the surgery done over there and have you recover over there with full-time nursing care in a nice atmosphere, and it costs about 1/3 as the same surgery here. So we may yet see the day when medical tourism becomes completely common because it saves you a lot more than the travel cost. And then we have to worry about whether their medical ethics are the same as our medical ethics and who does the informed consent and who pays, and yeah, there's a lot going on about that. Yes, right behind this man. One more question. You're it. Yes.
My question is, in the scientific community working in synthetic biology, are there some basic ethical guidelines, or has the community agreed on certain guidelines that they're working on?
Mostly, I think not. I mean, there are certainly rules, and there have been rules for a while, about the creation and handling of anything that might be a biohazard. There are all kinds of regulatory control to prevent lab escapes of potentially hazardous material and so on. But this doesn't, I think most of the researchers who work in the field think about it as just very cool manipulation of very tiny things. And they're thinking about downstream industrial applications and so on, but they're not focused on the huge ethical picture. There is debate around this, and the researchers are aware of it, but I don't think, apart from the ordinary ethical guidelines that govern scientific endeavor about honesty and reproducibility of results and biohazard control and publication and responsible conduct of research, all those things are in place the way they're in place for every kind of cell science or genomic science. But there isn't yet any kind of special code around the project of synthetic biology. I'm afraid we're out of time. In fact, we're more than out of time, but not by much more.